Hey everybody, welcome to the auxiliary bridge of the Starship MCDM. We're in the middle of editing a running the game video. We're trying to get the lighting exactly right because we moved a bunch of stuff around on the set. But in the meantime, I thought you might get a kick out of a discussion that we had on Twitch about Amazon's new series, Rings of Power. This is a somewhat long and rambling conversation, which is appropriate to Twitch. Whether or not it's appropriate to YouTube, that's up to you to decide. We cover a lot of topics, including my experience casting actors for video games, which we talk about because it's an illustration of the value of being surprised by things. Even as an author, the value of being surprised and seeing original ideas and original thoughts, even in an adaptation. We talk about my attitude toward TV, which that it is basically junk. And I'm not trying to convince anyone of the rightness of my attitudes or opinions. I'm not really interested in the consensus online. I generally find internet consensus to be junk. So honestly, the only reason to watch this video is because you're bored and you're interested in my entirely personal and somewhat idiosyncratic thoughts about this show, this adaptation of the appendices from Tolkien's trilogy. But there was one point I wanted to make that didn't come up in the stream that I thought was worth doing an intro for, and that is the role that Tolkien's Legendarium played in my nerd experience. I can't explain this. I don't know why this should be. The Silmarillion came out in the 70s when I was a kid. So by the time the 80s rolled around and I was an active nerd and I had a gaming group and we were playing D&D and tons of other games, we were all reading lots of fiction, lots of science fiction, lots of fantasy. We were devouring this stuff. But for whatever reason, only the Silmarillion, the Book of Lost Tales, only the deep lore, like the appendices from the Lord of the Rings, did we treat like it was real. Obviously, we didn't mistake it for real history, but it was this thing where knowing a lot about the deep lore of Middle-earth gave you nerd cred in a way that nothing else that we talked about did. There was just something about Tolkien's work, the depth and breadth of it. It seemed real in a way that no other lore really did. So I don't know why that should be. It has probably a unique combination of who we were as nerds in the 80s and just the incredible amount of thought and work Tolkien put into the backstory for his Legendarium. And of course, I would go on to end up working on a couple of different Lord of the Rings products professionally. And that's kind of when I became a professional Lord of the Rings nerd. I had to learn about all of this stuff. That's when I started reading the history of Middle-earth and I discovered the history of the Lord of the Rings. And I completely fell in love with it. As an author, I fell in love with it. But a lot of my passion and interest for this property goes all the way back to being a teenager when, even if you hadn't finished reading the Lord of the Rings, which I had not, right? I was absorbing a lot of this lore through osmosis, and you would just be really impressed if you were gaming with somebody and they knew the deep lore of Middle-earth. And I think that kind of motivated me to want to get into it. There are lots of books, movies, TV shows I love more, but there's always been something about Tolkien's work that just had an air of authenticity to it that has always impressed me and sort of given me permission to really, really like it and get into it and read a lot about it. That's it, folks. Maybe there's something in this video that you find interesting or thought-provoking, or maybe you just want to hang out with Uncle Matt for an hour and talk about nerd shit. By the way, this is a live stream where we talk like adults and use grown-up language, so, put earmuffs on your kids if they're watching. And like I said, you will be getting a new Running the Game video pretty soon, probably next week. Until then, let's get on with the show. I feel like I forgot to do something. Yeah, well, that's funny that your mom gets Sauron and Saruman confused, because that's why Saruman is called Aruman in the Ralph Bakshi adaptation, because he was like, these two names are too similar. It's like, you're right, they are. I completely agree. I'm not gonna share this with you because you'll see it eventually, but I have seen the final art for Count Rodar von Glauer, and it is like, I had no idea what this dude really looked like before we drew him. So I was just like, draw, let's just have a dope ass vampire lord. And Grace did a bunch of different versions, and I was like, I really like this one. This one's kind of cool because it surprised me, right? There's maybe a lesson here. It surprised me. It wasn't just generic vampire lord drawn really well. It had a certain character and quality to it that I hadn't pictured in the character. And that was cool. It's the reality on the ground is that I've been in charge of casting hundreds of parts in AAA video games. I think we had almost 300 characters in one game that I worked on. And you send out what are called it's the casting calls. They call them sides. I've never really understood why. And I've always had very idiosyncratic ideas about how you should cast these projects. Somewhat non-standard notions of this stuff. And we tried to cast, the last game I worked on, we tried to cast in the mix, so to speak, right? We set up a system whereby the actors, when they auditioned, they were reading lines of dialogue from conversations. And as a result, we could take all of their auditions and throw them into a tool that one of the programmers made for us. And everybody at the studio could sit there and click on, there's 4 characters, so A, B, C, D, with no names. Because if their names, if the people at the studio knew the name of the actor, they would go look them up on IMDb. And they would make judgments about their suitability for the role based on their IMDb record, which is that's not science. That's bullshit. So they were, I to whatever extent I could, I forced them to choose based on the audition, based on their performance. And so we took these conversations, which the actor just reads. The actor would get the conversation, but they would just read their lines, alone in the booth or whatever. And usually at home, probably at a home audition, especially if it were done now, it'd be a home audition. And then the tool would automatically lace their lines together to create a conversation you could listen to. But then you could dynamically just change. Let me hear it. So you weren't let me hear it with this person against these people. Let me hear it with this person against these folks. So what you saw was you'd have this first blush positive reaction to somebody's audition. But then when you listen to it in the mix with the other characters, it didn't necessarily sit well. And so people changed their minds, which was really cool. But the reason I bring this up is because you send out, some direction to the actor saying, like this, not like this, don't do that, do this. And every once in a while you'd get an audition from an actor who, this takes a lot of balls, by the way, and probably this tends to be actors that are not going to rely on this job to buy groceries, so they can take a little bit of a risk. But every once in a while I would get auditions from actors that just completely ignored my direction because they had an idea. Now that I would say 3 out of 4 times that person, no, I told you not to do that and you did it anyway. I cannot follow simple directions, right? But every once in a while, 25% is not bad, not a bad time. 25 of the people who would go off the ranch, so to speak, about a quarter of them would put something into their audition that really made me go, whoa, that's cool. I did not imagine this character that way. So there's probably a lesson here. And it might even relate to Rings of Power, is that, as authors, we like being surprised. I think I would say that in any kind of collaborative environment, the thing about collaboration that makes it valuable is not just that the best ideas bubble to the top. That does tend to happen, although it's not a law of physics or anything, but you get surprised and you get excited by the stuff that surprised you. Even if it's a character you created or something you invented, the fact that you're working with these other people who are responsible for implementing it, they're going to take it in strange, crazy directions. And some of those you're going to think are junk. And sometimes it's important to defend your original vision because you had this vision for a reason, right? These things don't just emerge out of the ether. They don't pass through a membrane from another dimension into this universe. Often when you're creating something, you do it for a reason, and it has certain boundaries, certain tones or themes that you're trying to reinforce. And this person doesn't necessarily know that. And so even though they have a really cool idea, you're like, well, but that's contrary to the point. And if you're a good artist and if you're a good leader, you can articulate that. If you just go, no, well, now that's not good that's not good feedback. But good feedback is you go, well, that's cool, but this is important. And that might be the first time this collaborator has heard that. And they're like, oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, in that case. So yeah, that's a part of the fun of doing this stuff. So it's shitty for the actors that did what you told them because they didn't get the gig and then, it's alchemical. You can't, sometimes people are inspired and And that's valuable. And if all you're going to do, we've talked about this before, if all you're going to do is what's on the page, well, then why are we working with you? Right? You got to take what's on the page and do something with it, right? You have to take what's on the page and, as my friend Phil says, you got to plus it, right? I remember we sent some cinematics to a cinematics house. There was a script and they literally just filmed what I wrote. And I was like, well, this is kind of junk, because the people, I worked hard on this and I was inspired and I cared about it. Everybody else in the chain has to feel the same way. Otherwise, you're just going to get something that is, flavorless and unconvincing. And that's what we got. And we could tell that these people were just in it for the paycheck. It's like, okay, well, happily that all got cut, so nobody ever saw it. But yeah, that happens. But we've talked about this before, and this gets into the Rings of Power thing, where there are people who they don't have a healthy relationship with the concept of art, right? They think that art should be wholesome and virtuous, and that if there's something in this work of art, that if these characters behave in bad or strange ways, that therefore the artist is a bad artist, because why would you make something like that? And I think those people tend to judge something like Rings of Power based purely on how closely does it hew to the original text, which is a kind of insanity, I think. I honestly genuinely think that's a kind of fascism, right? We are better. There are better things we can do with our lives than worship and grovel at the feet of some, author or work. Like, no. Like when I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, I imagined it in ways that Tolkien probably never thought of. But I bet if I told him about it, he would have been like, well, that's not how I imagined it, but that's fucking cool. Right? Good for you, right? I don't imagine he would have wanted everybody to imagine it exactly the same way as him, or indeed each other. And so that's what excites me, is when they kind of go, whoa. Sometimes I like it when they do the thing I wish they had done, right? And then sometimes I like it when they surprise me. So, yeah, I finished watching, hey everybody, this is the show. I finished watching Rings of Power, and I know many of you have heard this chunk before, but I'll try to keep it brief. I don't like television as a medium. I find it to be disposable. I've always felt that way. When I watched TV as a kid, and I watched a lot of TV as a kid, I was mostly surfing for like movies, or every once in a while you'd get something like I, Claudius, or stuff like Cosmos and The Day the Universe Changed that had a big impact on me. But I know how TV is made. They have about 10 days. There's sometimes it's not as bad as this, but they have about 10 days to write a script. And so when I watch TV, I'm often thinking to myself, yeah, this isn't bad for you had 10 days to write this script. But I don't, even the best television shows I've ever watched can't hold a candle to the best films I've ever seen. Film is a much more practiced and studied medium, and it's not usually disposable. The best films are not made to be disposable, but even the best TV, I think, largely is. Most people, they've got a job or they've got school. They get home at the end of the day. They've got to make or cook or eat dinner. They have to, do various bookkeeping tasks around the house. And eventually they're going to go to bed. And so they carve out some time where they can just sit on the couch and veg out and be a potato and have, see some bright lights and loud noises and people falling in love and a bit with a dog is what I think people expect. And that helps them unwind at the end of the day and they go to bed. But that is not a need I have ever had. And the older I get, it is less so, because I'm now at a place in my life where I can make things. I can make stuff, even if it's just screwing around with my modular synthesizer. No one ever hears it. I'm creating something and I'm having an experience, and that's hugely rewarding for me. And so even like a show like True Detective, which I really liked, that first season, it had 4 episodes, I think, out of 8, where nothing really happened, right? And so even a show like Rings of Power, which I think has a lot to recommend it, there are whole scenes, and there are many of these scenes where I can tell just by the setup of the scene, nothing's going to happen in this scene. We're not going to learn anything about these characters. We're not going to reinforce, the plot's not going to advance. That almost never fucking happens. The plot's not going to advance. We're not going to explicate character. We're not going to reinforce tone or theme. We're just going to waste time. and a bunch of people are going to talk, and they're not going to really say anything, and we're not going to learn anything we didn't before. So that's the context in which I say this stuff, and I realize that makes me sound pretentious or whatever. It's, I don't watch TV has been a very kind of elitist thing for people to say long before I came along. But I try to give you my reasons, right? Like I could literally never watch another television show as long as I live and not run out of brilliant movies to watch that I still haven't seen. And one of these days, I'm going to be lying in a hospital with tubes coming out of me, and I'm going to be thinking about how I lived my life now that I'm at the end of it. And I guarantee you, I'm not going to think, I wish I had watched more television. Nope. I'm going to think, wish I had written more. I wish I had hung out with my friends more. I wish I had gotten married and raised a family. I'll have lots of regrets, but watching more TV is not going to be one of them. So Rings of Power has a couple of strikes against it. I don't like television. I just don't like it as a medium. I think it's basically junk. And I'm a huge Tolkien nerd, but I'm idiosyncratically a Tolkien nerd. This isn't a good thing or a bad thing, by the way. I'm not holding this up as any kind of like virtue, but I really, really like The Lord of the Rings, right? I actually quite love The Hobbit. The Hobbit doesn't really have anything to do with Lord of the Rings. It wasn't even really set in Middle Earth when it came out. But these days, I think that's more common knowledge. I think Hobbit, for instance, is much more closely aligned with Dungeons and Dragons than anything in the Lord of the Rings is. But I didn't really like the Silmarillion. I thought it was boring and kind of unwritten. I was like, this is a chore. But I love Tolkien as a writer. That's the thing that I'm really sort of kind of obsessed with, is I've read a lot of books about Tolkien and his life and the things he did. And I've read a lot of books by Tom Shippey, who held the same chair as Tolkien at Oxford. Tolkien Oxford? Yeah. And we have the history of Middle Earth, which is a 3.5 volume series inside the larger, like 16 volume history. No, it's the history of the Lord of the Rings, which we have, which is 3 books and a bit inside the larger history of Middle Earth. The history of Middle Earth is basically everything Tolkien ever wrote about his world, including many, many different drafts and different versions of it. But the history of the Lord of the Rings is a 3 and a bit volume series about the writing of the Lord of the Rings, in which you get to see Tolkien's notes. Anytime he had a problem, he didn't have any collaborators. The guy was not a professional author. This is something people tend to overlook. I'm not sure why. He was a teacher. He wrote in his spare time. He never in his life had to make a living off of his writing. And at a time later, and the reason we get the Rings of Power is because when he was old and didn't want to write anymore and needed money, he sold the rights to his, he didn't go write another book. He could have done that and made a shitload of money, but he was old and didn't want to do that. And so he just sold the rights to his books to Hollywood, to the Saul Zaentz Corporation. And that's why we have the Rings of Power. So him as a writer, he didn't have anybody to talk to really about this stuff. He worked it all out himself, and he wrote to himself. He would write out the problem he was stuck on. Right. And no one's ever written a book like this before, I don't think, where he would get stuck. He would just sit down with no outline and no real idea what the plot was. And he would just start writing and following his muse until he got stuck. He wrote himself into a corner, which every writer does. And his solution was he would just put it down and go back to work, go teach kids and forget about it. And then something would inspire him and he'd be like, right. And he would go with this new solution in place. And he would start writing the entire trilogy over again from the beginning. And you're like, are you kidding me? Right? And that's one of the reasons The Lord of the Rings is so weird, because it gave him a chance to kill his darlings, right? The idiosyncratic nonsense that he loved, which, I mean, if you say that about The Lord of the Rings, idiosyncratic nonsense that Tolkien loved, I bet you, if you're a fan of those books, can think of something that qualifies with that. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about all the shit he cut because it was dumb. And even though he loved it, he loved the idea of Trotter, who was this mysterious character that the hobbits were going to meet at Bree and was going to lead them to Rivendell. And who was Trotter? He was probably a hobbit, and he wore shoes. Hobbits don't wear shoes. That's why they called him Trotter. Maybe he was actually Bilbo in disguise, right? And that was Trotter for a long time. And Bilbo's nephew was named Bingo for a long time. Many drafts. And then eventually he's like, no, that's stupid. He should be Strider and he should be Aragorn somewhat at the last minute. Right? So thank God he wrote this way, because otherwise we would have been stuck with Bingo and Trotter. So I find this stuff fascinating. So I flatter myself to think that I understand how that dude thought and why he wrote the things he wrote and what mattered to him. I don't really. I'm not Tom Shippey. I'm not one of those guys. I'm not John Ratliff, for instance. But I've read more than most people, more than most fans, I would say. And the Rings of Power has a tough job. The only thing I can compare it to is sort of like the Daniel Craig the Daniel Craig James Bond movies, because they have to make all the fans happy and they've got to capture a new audience. So they have to do it the way everybody expects, but they've got to do something new, right? And that was Casino Royale. And I was like, damn, they knocked this out of the park. I don't think that, unfortunately, they couldn't sustain it. And that's largely because the production company was always in financial straits. So they never knew if there was going to be another movie. Rings of Power kind of has the same thing. They got to make, they can't alienate all the kids that grew up watching the Lord of the Rings, either in the theater or on Blu-ray or DVD or whatever. You know, the kids that have Lord of the Rings toothbrushes and pillowcases. That's not me, but there's at least one, if not two generations of kids that grew up with the Peter Jackson movies. So they can't alienate those kids. Although I probably would have been happier if they had. You know, I would have loved to see Jodorowsky's Dune, for instance. Even though I know lots of people who are like, it wouldn't have been Dune. I'm like, no, of course it would have been. Dune is a novel written by Frank Herbert. Denis Villeneuve's Dune is not Dune. It's Denis Villeneuve's movie. It's got shit in it that he cares about and that he likes and things that Dune inspired him to do. He might even disagree with Frank Herbert in some spaces and be like, no, we're not going to do it that. We're going to do it this way. Good. It's an adaptation. That's the point. You want the original? There it is. Go read it. It's not going anywhere. So they've got to make the Peter Jackson fans happy. And they've got to, they would probably like to make the Tolkien nerds happy, although they don't really have a lot of control over that, you know. Like I said, I worked with a guy, very smart dude, a guy I liked working with, thought was a really good designer. And we went and saw, I think it was The Two Towers in a preview screening because we were licensors. And after we came out, he was just miserable. And he was like, I don't understand. The Tolkien already wrote the movie. Just film every sentence. And that he honestly, that was the way he thought. He literally thought just film every sentence, which is, that does not make any literal sense because, you know, there's a lot of stuff that he describes that are internal thoughts, right? That are high level, you know, how would you do that? Doesn't make any sense. But there are lots of people like that guy. So they can't make those people happy, but they have to also engage a new audience. It has to stand on its own. It has to be its own thing, right? It can't just be the Leo pointing meme. It's mostly the Leo pointing meme. That's this first season. Now, will the second season be like that? It can't be. But I think a lot of the people who were engaging with this series, these 8 episodes, yeah, these 8 episodes, I think a big part of it was just trying to see, we recognize all the jigsaw pieces, right? We're just trying to see where they're all going to fit together. And so it delights us when we go, oh, that's this. And I was one of those people. I was like, holy shit, are we going to get to see the fall of Numenor? Is that part of the story of the Forging of the Rings of Power? I don't remember it that way. Wait a minute. Are we going to, hang on a minute. Is the Battle of the Last Alliance, that's Gil-galad and Elrond, and that's Isildur and Elendil. Were they there for the Forging of the Rings of Power? Is that? And I went and looked it up because my memory isn't perfect, but I was like, this seems really suspicious. And in point of fact, no, they weren't, right? And I think this is probably good, right? They're like, we don't have the rights to the Silmarillion, which blew my mind. We have the rights to the appendices. And I'm like, oh, well, you know what? The Silmarillion's a bunch of different unconnected stories, for one thing. There's a thread that runs through a lot of them, the Silmarils. But taking the stuff, that was one of the reasons, by the way, I started to pay attention to the series. There were a couple of things. One, I discovered that they did not have the rights to the Silmarillion. I thought that the money they spent, $500 million, or one unfinished Star Citizen, was buying the rights to the Silmarillion, because Christopher Tolkien, the executor of the estate, Tolkien's son would not sell them. He thinks his dad made a mistake selling the rights to the original trilogy. But he's dead, and there's a new steward, this new steward of Gondor. There's a new executor of the estate, and I just assumed that whoever that person was going to be perfectly fine, wringing some filthy lucre out of his grandfather's work or her grandfather's work. I don't know who the executor of the estate is, but I was wrong. So I was like, wait a minute, they don't have wait, what does that mean? Does that mean they're going to invent their own second age? And I sort of imagine it being a lot more radical than what it is, right? What we're seeing is kind of the greatest hits, but I was imagining them kind of doing something cool from whole cloth. And so that kind of made my ears prick up. And then somebody started tweeting, people were tweeting about one of these characters in the show. And I didn't know who this was, but they're like, who's this mysterious stranger? And I was like, oh, it's Gandalf. Right. And I was like, that's cool that that's their Gandalf actor, because, and for whatever reason, seeing this actor, I don't think I've seen before in something, seeing this actor, they just had a look to them. And I was like, that's really cool. That looks like that actor could have been a movie star in the 1970s, back when normal people could be movie stars. That was a very brief period called the New Hollywood, right? Like, Cary Grant didn't look like a normal person. But this guy has he looks like he walked out of a Jodorowsky movie. He sort of looks like the guy from Holy Mountain. And I was like, oh, that's cool. There are normal looking people in this show. Neat. And also I discovered that Lenny Henry was in it. And Lenny Henry is a name I hadn't heard in 30 years. That dude was all over my TV in the 1980s. He had his own show, which I loved. And I just thought he was awesome. And I watch a lot of British comic TV, Would I Lie to You? The Unbelievable Truth, which is a radio thing, Taskmaster, 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown. And I'd never seen him anywhere. I just kind of thought he fell off the face of the earth. So I was like, hey, Lenny Henry is in this, man. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, well, I'm gonna have to watch at least some of this. But also my friends Tom and Anna were really into it. And they're like, Matt, you got to watch it. And I'm like, okay, all these things added up to me being engaged, because I thought they're gonna have to do something a little bit new. And they are doing something new. They're taking the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, which is sort of like the highlights of the Silmarillion, and just imagining, what if all those things all took place at the same time? What if Atlantis sunk beneath the waves at the same time they were forging the rings of power? At the same time, we get the fall of Khazad-dûm. And I was like, that's cooler than doing each one of those things on your own by itself. And would you even get to do them all by themselves? Probably not. So the money would run out or whatever. So I gave it a shot. And it's pretty as fuck, right? That's not the most insightful thing I could say. It looks better than the Peter Jackson movies. The Peter Jackson movies were done on a shoestring budget, right? They got more money than it would take to make one movie, but a lot less than it takes to make three. So there's a comment Peter Jackson makes in the making of stuff where he's like, this is the biggest low budget movie ever made. And I think he was being literally true. Like, you can see how they did everything DIY, right? And you compare the Rings of Power to that, and I think the Rings of Power looks way better. And there's stuff in it that I really like. I really like the Galadriel actor. I think she's doing a killer job. I'm not sure, and I think the characterization is really strong. I think that we'll talk about how her story has been evolving. It seems a little bit weird to me. There's a trilogy of really, really interesting books. They're not fiction. They're just 3 books called These Are the Voyages, which is about the production of the original series of Star Trek. This is a dude who Gene Roddenberry hired to be his biographer at the end of his life. And it gave him access to all of the notes and memos that they had from making that show in the 60s, back when there was no email. And if you wanted to tell somebody what you thought, you had to write it out in triplicate. And so we have all of these discussions and arguments about how they were going to make this show. So in these books about the production of Star Trek, you get one of thousands of memos going back and forth between the sort of the authors of the show. It was Gene Roddenberry's idea, but there were 3 people who I think are actually the authors of Star Trek, and that's Gene Kuhn, Robert Justman, and Dorothy Fontana. And between the 3 of them, they knew what made good characters, they knew what made good stories, and they knew what made Star Trek. And Gene Roddenberry, by the time I think the 2nd season was done, he was off the show. NBC hated working with him so much. And so I think it's Bob Justman who writes this memo talking about why he doesn't like this script. And he just uses it as an opportunity. He uses it as an opportunity to explain the difference between a good episode of TV and a bad episode of TV. And he said, in a good episode of TV, the conflict arises naturally out of the character's motivations. A bad episode of TV, the conflict arises because it has to in order to move. In a bad episode of television, the characters do the things they need to do to advance the plot. Right? And he's like, and this is a bad episode of TV. Well, there's a lot of that in Lord of the Rings where it's like, I don't think this character would do this, but this is what's necessary to advance the plot. I don't always feel that way. Every once in a while, you get a genuine, authentic moment. And I'm like, oh, that was really cool. Kind of a little breathtaking that we got this moment. And one of them was when Durin gives the mithril to Elrond. Now, that advanced the plot. That was necessary for where we ended up. However, in the moment, it did not feel that way to me. It felt authentic and genuine, and like this moment arose dynamically. It almost felt real. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you're really doing it, you write these moments. Let's imagine there was no other Lord of the Rings. The Rings of Power was a brand new show cut from whole cloth, and there was no Hobbit, and there was no Peter Jackson movies or even a novel or anything like that. They just came up with this idea. Right? Well, that would mean somebody would be writing this moment and this scene and be like, he should just fucking give it to him as a gift, as an emblem of their friendship. And then every time we see it, it's going to remind us of how much these two guys love each other and the adventures they had together and all the strife and them overcoming it and getting over themselves. Right? That's what this is going to represent. You would just write that in the moment. It would feel real and natural and right. And then later on, you would discover, oh shit, I know how I can get the Rings of Power made. Right? I can use this. Right? That's how actual authors write stuff, is that they're there in the moment and they discover this whatever it is, this plot point, they discover it, and then they want to use all the parts of the buffalo. Then later on, when they're stuck and they wrote themselves into a corner, they go, oh, wait, I've got this little bit of mithril. I could go do, right? That's how good that moment was, is it felt like that, even though it was not one of those. It's entirely synthetic, but it worked on me. There's lots of stuff in the show that works on me. I really, really like the way they depicted the arrival of probably Gandalf, right? Because I've said this in an earlier stream. I apologize for those of you that heard this before. I don't like Ian McKellen as a movie actor. I realize this is a controversial statement. However, on my side, I am able to count Ian McKellen. He knows a lot about movie acting and he knows a lot about theater acting and he knows that he's really good at one of them. And there was a great interview with him after, I think it might have been after he did Richard III, his movie of Richard III, which is, by the way, brilliant. And the way he came up with a World War II Nazi commanders, a reason why they would say my kingdom for a horse is fucking brilliant. Really inspired. And he was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him, was talking about what a great actor he is and all this stuff and all the achievements in his life. This was before he played Gandalf, by the way. And he said, is there anything else that you want to do? You've done it all. And he goes, yeah, I would like to be as good a film actor as Brendan Fraser. And that may seem like a radical thing to say, but go back and watch A Quiet American and the movie about James Whale, which I can continue to space on. But that's the movie he did with Brendan Fraser. Somebody in chat is going to know that. Yeah, Lead Poison, Gods and Monsters. Thank you, Heels, LFW. Gods and Monsters. Yeah. But you got to understand that Ian McKellen, that statement's not coming out of any sense of ego. That is a purely pragmatic statement from a professional. Because Brendan Fraser is a movie star. He's a movie actor. He knows that the camera's about that far away. He knows that the most subtle expression is going to show up. Right. So even when these really, really good movie stars and movie actors are doing it over the top, like go watch 12 Angry Men and watch the one movie star in the cast. You would know, even if you never knew who any of these actors were, even if you had never heard of Henry Fonda, if you go watch 12 Angry Men for the first time, you'd go, that guy's a movie star, because he underplays every moment. All the other actors are either theater actors or TV actors, right? And they were chosen that way on purpose, to give a sense of people from lots of different walks of life, right? Their characters come from all different backgrounds and walks of life. So the director, Sidney Lumet, his first movie, one of the great American film directors, the director deliberately, same thing Ridley Scott did with Alien, by the way, and it also worked. He deliberately went out and got actors from different backgrounds. Let's get a movie star, Henry Fonda. Let's get some TV actors. Let's get some theater actors. And Henry Fonda is, even though film is the biggest of those mediums, Henry Fonda is the most inward directed person in that room. Everybody else is doing something flamboyant, right? And he's doing the opposite, right? So that's Brendan Fraser can do that, right? Brendan Fraser knows how to do that. He knows what the camera can do, and he did not come up in the theater the way Ian McKellen did. And so when you see him in a movie like The Quiet American or Gods and Monsters, you're watching world-class performances, I think. And Ian McKellen knows that. And you watch every Ian McKellen film performance, and it's all like, he's got all these quirks that he relies on, right? That don't in any way further his performance. They just kind of help distract you from the fact that the guy's not a natural film actor. He can't just be in the moment. He's got to act. He's got to perform, and it kills him. He hates it. So I never really liked Ian McKellen as Gandalf. He played Gandalf like he was an old man, and Gandalf's not an old man. He's not a man of any stripe, manner, fashion, or form. I wanted to see the Istari in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. And I didn't get to, and that's fine. That's fine. Peter Jackson would have had to invent that moment. You don't really see it in the books either. Except maybe when he's fighting Gandalf a little bit. But even when Ian McKellen was fighting Gandalf, he seemed like he was tired and out of breath. And I'm like, not Gandalf, man. He seemed like an old man. It's okay for Gandalf to get tired, but he shouldn't get tired the way, it's kind of like Robert De Niro being de-aged. It's like you still fight like you're in your 60s. I can tell. It's the same thing. It's like, yeah, Gandalf is tired at that point, but he's not old man tired. And so getting to see the Istari arrive in Middle Earth, I was over the moon. I was like, yes, that is it. That's what I mean when I like it. Sometimes I like it when you show me something that I want to see, but you do it better than I would have thought you could. And I'm like, oh, that's super cool. It's one of the Istari. Yes, of course they would do that. Yeah, this is awesome. Oh, he doesn't know where he is. And I think it's kind of weird. This is not a Tolkien-esque thing. Tolkien would have been like, what are you doing? It's kind of weird that the subtext of that character is that if this dude had landed somewhere else, that he wouldn't have turned out to be as good as he is. But he landed near the hobbits, and so the hobbits kind of infected him a little bit. And it's I like that as plotting and story. I think that's awesome, but it's a very modern idea. And Tolkien would not have been. He would have been like, no, Gandalf is. They're all the Istari are the Istari. It doesn't matter where they would have landed. They would have been them. There's a certain amount of essentialism to who they are. They are literally angels. So that was kind of weird. But there was another line from Nori that that was very Tolkien-esque, and unfortunately now I cannot remember it. Oh, Sidney Lumet's Making Movies is a really, really good book. If you're only going to read one book, read one book about movies, read Sidney Lumet's Making Movies. Designer Club said that something had made them find him, right? That there was a purpose behind this. Well, that is right out of the Lord of the Rings, right? Tolkien was quite unfashionably at that place and time Catholic, and he believed all that stuff. And so everybody in Middle Earth is talking about God all the time. They just don't use that word, right? But they're always talking about some greater purpose that even more so than the Valar, right? There's some greater purpose guiding us. And Galadriel says something similar, but it kind of contradicts stuff that she had said earlier. There's a lot of times when characters behave in ways that they have to behave in order to serve the plot, which is never awesome. And Galadriel suffers from that more than most, certainly more, I think, than the Hobbits. The Hobbits, maybe because they're kind of a B plot, are sort of allowed to be themselves more. The Hobbit storyline sort of felt a little bit more natural. And I had fewer instances where I felt like, this is a scene that serves no purpose when I was hanging out with the Hobbits. Yeah, like Faramir, God calling Faramir over and over and over again and being like, fuck it, Boromir will do, right? Or the elves at one point, I think of the elves that Frodo and the folk meet in the Old Forest say something about some greater power. Aragorn sort of hints at the coming of Jesus at one point, which is cool. The one who will heal the world, that kind of shit. That's all through the Lord of the Rings. So it was cool when Nori said that. That was cool. I like that. I thought they're making Galadriel the hero, and that makes total sense because Galadriel is an elf lord or elf lady, whatever, you know what I mean. She's an elf lord, and she's She's practically, if not literally, the equal to like a Balrog, in terms of power, or one of the Maiar. So it's cool that she should be this kind of like warrior adventurer. That's neat. And it makes sense to me that she would be obsessed with something, because she's going to have some kind of character flaw to overcome. Otherwise, why is she in this show? Right? There has to be some arc to her character if she's a main character. And the idea that she's obsessed and racked with guilt because of things she didn't do, I think that makes total sense to me. That sounds like a perfectly good story for Galadriel. Why not? We don't know what Galadriel was doing at this place in time per se, so we got to come up with something that sounds as good as anything. I felt like her obsession with kind of like, where is Sauron? What happened to him? Is he gone? And the fact that like everyone else thinks, oh, he's gone forever, and she's the only one that believes, that felt really artificial to me. That didn't feel natural. I don't believe that no elf would think that Sauron was still hanging out. I kind of feel like they'd be like, yeah, he's around here somewhere. I can feel it. Right? So that felt very artificial and forced and not natural. But that's not a criticism of that actor's performance, by no means. Nor is it even a criticism of the idea that Galadriel would be kind of obsessed and behaving in a manner that is out of character. It's just the way that obsession manifested itself, I thought, was very, serving the story and not the character. Moving the plot forward because you have to. I really liked Arondir. I thought this is as far as I know, this is a character made from whole cloth, and the fact that he's having romance with a human woman, the fact that she seems like she stepped out of a catalog when everyone else in that town looks like, they're from a Rembrandt painting, like, dirty and dark and everything. And then all of a sudden she's wearing this beautiful blue outfit, and it cut very strange for a woman in that place and time, whatever. But I liked her, and I liked him, and I liked them, and I liked it. And it was super cool. And I liked it when Arondir is like the only sort of like wood elf guerrilla warrior among the humans. And so when it's time to fight, that dude's doing like half the work, and we get to see him fight. And it's not kind of silly, Legolas. It's not silly Legolas nonsense that we got in the movie that was very kind of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle shit. It's like legit. It's cool. It's neat. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. And the kind of the A-team stuff, which is, I realize now, that's the letter A dash TEAM, not 18. This is now an obscure reference, but that idea that they were ready and they prepped, and you get to see all the traps they laid, right? And and Arondir runs around kicking them off and stuff. I was like, this is fucking cool. I thought that stuff was neat. I was incredibly let down by the fact that this sort of dollar store Aragorn shows up, does basically nothing. And this woman that we have been following now for several hours, and who has almost kind of single-handedly led her people and saved them from despair and darkness, just immediately goes, oh shit, we have a king? Oh, thank God I don't have to do this anymore. Are there any babies I can birth, or fucking pies I can make or something? Because I would much rather have a man in charge of everything. And I was like, what are you doing? Is there anything in this person's character or anything they've done that would lead you to, what about the people? Would the people be okay with this? And be like, well, who's this asshole? I was happy with you in charge. You're the only reason we're still alive. You and the elf. So why don't you two people run this place? I actually believe that leadership is important. I would believe that. Look who I am and what I do. I believe leadership is important, right? I don't think the people can just self-assemble out of nothing and be a autonomous collective. I think there needs to be people in charge, and there needs to be checks and balances. So I was like, yeah. And then I was like, this is super weird and out of character, and I didn't like it. And I'm not sure I like it more now that I know what's going on. So the show makes a lot of hay off of is that the Leo pointing meme? And I enjoyed that too, because there wasn't a whole lot of show to enjoy. There was, I would say it's 80% scenes that you don't need, that you could have cut and no one would have noticed. So in that context, it's cool that I've got something to do. But the things I liked, like the Istari, the reveal of who Sauron is at the end, are really hard to do. They're really hard. And so I'm like, that's awesome that you pulled that off. Like there are a lot of characters in this show. If you just looked at the script and you cut all of the names so you had no idea who was talking, you would not be able to tell who was talking. There are some exceptions, right? Like you would be able to tell this is a hobbit versus this is an elf, but you wouldn't be able to tell which hobbit. You wouldn't be able to tell which elf. They don't really have what I would consider, it's an ensemble show. There's a huge fucking cast. So the characterization, which to me is super important, as a consumer of entertainment, is a really thin on the ground, right? It's like, that's the pissed off elf. That's the other pissed off elf. That's the obsessive elf. And these are one-dimensional characters. So that was kind of a letdown. I really liked the way they showed I liked seeing Khazad-dûm and it's at its height, although it still felt a little provincial and dark to me. I think they could have plussed that a little bit more and impressed us more, because the more it looks like, I mean, they could have made it look like the Jetsons for all they could have made it look like some kind of dope ass retro future, almost science fiction thing, and I would have been happier, even though that would have been a lot weirder, because the more remarkable it is, then the more our hearts hurt, because we've been to Moria after the fall. They haven't, right? And I like that dramatic irony. So it was just fine. It was fine. I was like, okay, this is fine. It's not bad. I just think they could have gone a lot further with that. I also, Reds fan 77 says, I liked Elrond's and Durin's friendship. I liked it too. But I felt like it is largely unearned, right? We never get to really see why they're friends. They're making a lot of hay off of the fact that they had some kind of awesome adventures when they were younger together. And we never got to see that. We only see them after there's been a falling out. And again, this falling out felt really weak. It felt forced. This is just these characters shouldn't hate each other, but they do. And there's not really a good reason for it. And lazy writers would say, well, but that's why his wife is so upset with them, because there isn't a good reason for this. I'm like, well, but you wrote the wife. This didn't happen in real life. You know that, right? You invented this whole thing, right? So I do like these two actors, and I like their characterizations, and I do think there's some fun chemistry between them, which is important. Not only lovers need to have chemistry when it comes to acting. So that's really cool. But I want to see. You had like 8 hours more, probably. You had 8 hours. You could have given us some time with these two characters really doing something together. And we didn't really get that. Not in a way that I found satisfying. So again, it's a lot of the stuff. It's some of it's good. Some of it I liked, some of it I didn't. Right. That's why I preface this by saying, I don't really like TV. So, God, I feel like there's a lot to talk about. Am I going to watch season 2? Yeah, probably. I want to see what happens to Gandalf when he goes to Hrun. Obviously, casting the hobbits as like Irish travelers just seems insane to me. Like I'm astonished that they thought they'd get away with that, and then I'm astonished that they did. But whatever. People seem to like easy answers to complex questions, right? So whenever Tolkien comes up, Tolkien is a beloved author, and I don't think he's going to get canceled anytime soon. He's not likely to say anything now that is going to piss anybody off. But when people are looking to criticize him, they bring up his statements on orcs, one specific statement. And he really did say that, and he really did think that way. And just go look at when he was born and what time, and you would not be surprised that he would think that way. In fact, you're surprised when you find out some of the other things he said about not having Jewish heritage, right? And like you're like, yeah, fuck yeah, good for him. What they don't bring up, what people who are being critical of Tolkien never seem to bring up, is his enormous classism, which to me is way more problematic than one statement about orcs, right? He said a lot about orcs, and a lot of it was very insightful, by the way. Like, holy shit, the classism in Lord of the Rings is insane. And it's all throughout this show. And I don't like it. I don't like that. I didn't like it when she, for instance, oh, are you our king? Awesome. Thank God. All hail the king. No, dumb. So I kind of feel like the Irish travelers and the received pronunciation elves are all part of that. That's not how hobbits talked in the Peter Jackson movies, but whatever. It's not, that's just me. Thoughts on the characterization of Gil-galad. I don't like Gil-galad. I like Gil-galad and Celebrimbor. I don't like, the thing is, we don't know what happened to Gil-galad, right? He fell into shadow is I think how we describe fighting Sauron. So we need to see that character arc, right? And I don't, so it's, for me, a lot of when I watch the show, I'm aware of how drama works, right? And so I'm like, how are they going to do this with that? Because we know this happens, and this isn't really the right arc for that. But you know, sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes I'm surprised. I'm like, oh, that's fucking cool. Like the Halbrand, is that guy's name? Halbrand. Halbrand's a real guy, or a real fictional guy. Anyway, like that arc I thought was really well done. I am hard to surprise when it comes to this stuff. I'm old, for one thing. The older you get and the more media you watch, the harder it is to surprise you because you've seen all the tricks. And so if I'm watching a show like this and something completely fucking obvious happens, but it takes me by surprise, right? And everyone else watching was like, well, what did you think was going to happen? I'm like, I wasn't thinking. That's the point. The show was working on me. Like, we get to see the formation of Mount Doom. And I felt like the logic of it was a little tortured, right? Like a character kind of explains, oh yeah, while Sauron was here, he did all this kind of like engineering stuff. And you're like, what? And then you see Mount Doom happen, and it's because of that. And I was like, I don't think I need that explanation, actually. I think we could have just done something cool to make a volcano happen. But when we see Mount Doom happen, I'm like, what the fuck? Is that Autumno? That doesn't make any sense. What is going on? And I was completely gobsmacked. I was unmoored. I was where the characters were, which is really good writing and pacing, really good pacing. Because I was like, and it took me probably like 8 seconds, which felt like 5 minutes to go, oh, it's Mount Doom. Fuck, that's cool. We got to see Mount Doom birthed. Neat, right? It's like, sure, of course. It has to come from somewhere, right? Makes as much sense as anything. So I thought that was really cool. And I am watching this show, by the way. I have more reason to like it than most. I'm watching this show at 100 inches in 4K, right? It looks like a movie. It looks like a movie. And the episode after the Mount Doom eruption, Orodruin, you know, it's all orange and ash and there's no sun in the sky. And the quality and it was crystal clear. It looked amazing. It looked really amazing. So I thought that was cool. Yeah, there's things I like. There's things I don't like. I really like, for whatever reason, the Elrond actor reminds me a lot of my friend Liam. Like, it makes me think Liam could have done that. Like I said, I like the Galadriel actor and I like her performance and I like the decision to make her kind of obsessed with something that's unhealthy. I just felt like that the way they executed on it was pretty weak. I like the fact we still don't know that the stranger, for now, I must remain a stranger. We still don't know that the stranger is Gandalf, but who the fuck else is it going to be? And at this point, we know he's in Astari, so he's one of those guys. I don't care if he's Radagast or Saruman. It would make sense for him to be Saruman in a certain sense, because we want to like Saruman. We have to like Saruman, so that when we go back and watch the Peter Jackson movies, we're like, oh fuck, I forgot. This guy turns evil. Well, he only turned evil like an hour and a half before those movies started. Right. So it makes sense that we're going to get to meet good Saruman here, and he should be awesome. We should love him and want to follow him and be glad that he's the leader, so that when he falls, it means more. But it's super weird that, like, if it's not Gandalf, then they've got some answering to do, because like Gandalf was kind of the only person in Middle Earth who knew what a hobbit was, right? Who had actually been there and seen them. They were legendary to the elves and the other Istari and all that shit. You know, so that would be kind of weird if it's not Gandalf. It's probably Gandalf, right? I really like that guy's entire plot line. Like, I like that whole thing. I thought it was really well done. I like, even at the end, Gandalf has a line of dialogue, or that character has a line of dialogue where you could sort of feel that they're like, well, we can't do what we want to do. Like Gandalf and Mithrandir, like I think his real name is like Orome or something like that. I don't remember what it is. It's got an O in there somewhere. But all we know is what other people call him, right? The Grey Pilgrim, Gandalf, you know, Mithrandir just means the Grey Pilgrim, I think. So he can't call himself those things. Those are things other people are going to call him. So there's a moment where he's supposed to say, I'm Batman, right? He has his I'm Batman moment, and he can't do that. So he just says, I'm good, right? Which is not the most dramatic thing to say in that moment, I don't think, right? Reminds me of my friend Dave playing a Dune collectible card game tournament at a convention and trying to decide who to attack. And he turns to the guy on his right and he goes, are we good? And the guy's like, I'm good. And Dave's like, we're not good. And attacks the guy. That's what it felt like. That was a little weird, but that was the only weird part, and otherwise incredibly well written, I thought, and well structured and well paced. It had drama, it had character, it had action, right? So even though it's kind of a B plot, I was super, super hooked, and I like the way they depict magic. It's very faithful, I think, to what Tolkien would have had to do if he made a movie, right? Because magic doesn't really work that way in Middle Earth. Tolkien wasn't smart enough to have played Dungeons and Dragons and know how spells are supposed to work, right? So he just went with his gut, and it's a lot more dramatic and natural and magical. It's a lot more magical. Tolkien's magic is a lot more appealing to me than like spell slots and, Vancian bullshit. But it has to be more kinetic. That's the thing that Peter Jackson did. And they're basically just using Peter Jackson's visual design language in this film when it comes to how wizards fight and what they do. But it was also really poetic. There's a moment where Gandalf, fucking says, begone, foul Dwemer Lake, or whatever, begone, monger of kills, and kind of literally blows these three, I don't know what they are, cultists? I don't know what they are. Are they supposed to be the kings of men? They sort of look like the kings of men once you shine the light of the netherworld on them. But those guys don't happen until you get the rings of men. So what the fuck? And all of a sudden there's like a moth. And was it a death's head moth? That would be a little obvious. I don't think it was. And they turn into moths. Which in a certain kind of design language, moths are symbols of decay, right? Old musty closet has moths feeding on the things that live in it, and you open it up and they fly out, and it's a sign of disuse and decay. They're also, obviously, moths are beautiful and cool in the real world. So that was neat. That was one of those visual moments where I'm like, I don't know what I just saw or why, but that's poetry. It's beautiful and it's neat and it's challenging, and I thought that was cool. So, and they do a really good job. They know who the audience is, and they know the audience are playing the Leo pointing meme game. So the idea that character, the stranger, the idea that dude might be Sauron would seem patently ridiculous to me. Sauron doesn't fall out of the sky like that. So when those cultists who apparently are not Istari, I sort of assumed that the Eminem looking one was like one of the blue wizards, or maybe Saruman. They're just occultists. They're just like actual magicians, which exist in Middle Earth. I think, as far as I know, there are normal people in Middle Earth that can do quote unquote magic. And I think they actually, at one point, it might be in The Hobbit, where somebody refers to them as magicians, as like an insult. So they can do stuff. I mean, there's werewolves and vampires in Lord of the Rings, if I recall correctly. Just not in Middle Earth, I should say, not in those books. So that's cool. I thought that whole thing was neat. And then it turns out they're looking for Sauron. Awesome. And so there's a little mistaken identity, but also challenging Gandalf's identity, which we know isn't going to work. We know that's not going to work, right? I don't think the audience for a second, at that moment, I should say, I don't think the audience for a second believed that was Gandalf, largely because of, I think, the quite deft way they structured that last episode, which makes earlier stuff that I didn't care about seem better by comparison, right? And now we're getting into the Halbrand thing. I was pretty sure that was one of the Nazgul, right? Because they're going to be in this show sooner or later, right? So, and they're going to get rings and they become kings of men. So where are they? But people in chat, when we were talking about this in earlier streams, was like, I think he's Sauron. Well, that was not convincing to me, because I think Lenny Henry's Sauron. And I'm like, these people are just, they're just memeing. They're not seriously thinking about this and having an opinion. They're just participating in the meme culture, which is fine. I actually think meme culture is very creative, and people don't take it seriously enough, and they should. But when people in chat were like, I think that dude's Sauron, I was like, nah, it's probably one of the Nazgul. But I was like, this is what I said. And I said this on Twitter, and I said this in our private Discord, and I might have said this on the live stream. I was like, if you want to know who Sauron is, you got to look to the forging of the rings, because he's there. Well, I think technically, based on the actual lore, I don't even think he was in Middle Earth when the 3 rings were made, but he taught Celebrimbor how to do it. So when Celebrimbor used Sauron's recipes, Sauron was able to kind of go back and say, haha, I can now make a ring that will, right? So when people in chat were like, I think he's Sauron, I was like, nah. And they went, well, he is a smith. And they make a point of it. They make a point of it. He's not just a smith, right? Lots of characters are just things, right? They just, that's this person, that's that person, you know, but that's not their, like Elendil is a captain of that boat, right? But being the captain of that boat is not his defining characteristic, right? They don't make a thing about it. It's just a thing that dude does, right? But they made a point about the fact that this dude was a smith. And so I was like, huh, maybe. I didn't believe it. But I was like, could be. But that's the point, is that it's their show. They can do whatever the fuck they want with it, right? That the stranger could be Saruman for all we know. It could be Radagast. We don't know. It's probably Gandalf, sure, but we don't know. It'd be weird, but lots of things are weird that happen in real world. So I knew that was Sauron. I went from not thinking he was Sauron, thinking he was going to be an Nazgul, one of the kings of men, to instantly knowing he was Sauron when Celebrimbor walks into his, or he's like going to turn the lights on in his shop or something, and he hears a noise, and he's like, hello? Who's there? Well, that is not a thing that you do in a scene that isn't intended to have a horror element to it. That is a scene from horror movies, right? Hello? Who's there? Is somebody here? Who made that noise? That kind of like, that's horror movie plotting, right? And it's framed in a horror movie sense, right? Where you have the frame and then you have the character kind of looking around, right? Like they're not in the center of the frame heroically. They're poking their head in from the side and looking around, even though it's his place. He's poking like he's afraid, right? Like it's a very tentative way for a character to enter into a frame. It's got all this horror movie language to it. And I was like, oh, that's Sauron. Of course it fucking is. Of course it fucking is. I had not really noticed or cared that Galadriel was bringing Halbrand to Numenor. I hadn't really, or is it Numenor, or are they in Numenor, or are they in, no, they're in, I don't even know what that place is, but it's is it the Grey Havens? I don't fucking know. But Middle Earth, where the elves are. Eregion, right? So she's going to take him to Eregion. This is what I mean when I said, when it's done well, I don't notice obvious shit. That's what doing it well means. Everything's obvious in retrospect once you know it, right? But really super obvious shit, even in Marvel movies every once in a while. Well, like the Sony Marvel movies often, you know, it's really obvious things work on me because I was in the moment. The film worked on me and I was just going along with it. And I was like, but if I had been thinking about it, which I only do when things aren't working, if I had been thinking about it, I would have gone, oh, of course she's bringing him here because he's Sauron. He has to be here to help with the rings. So as soon as Celebrimbor is like, hello, I was like, oh, fuck. The smith is here. She brought the guy who knows how to work metal to Celebrimbor. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Neat. I thought that's neat. Cool. And so from that point forward, we were off to the races and I was down. I was like, cool. And I like how they do such a good job of making him sort of like not a scheming evil madman, right? That even when I knew he was Sauron, I believed in his halbradness, if that makes sense. And I'll tell you something else. This show has the same problem that Stranger Things has. In fact, actually, I think this show and Stranger Things have a lot more in common than people imagine, structurally. And that is, whenever the main characters have to monologue at each other, everything falls apart, right? The worst scene and the worst thread in the entire fucking show, I would literally fire this writer if they worked for me. I would try to do it in a nice way, but I would have been like, this didn't work out. Here's a really good severance. I'll give you a great recommendation, but I have got to quarantine you from my story. Was the first scene with baby Galadriel and her older brother and some elf bullies and a boat. And it's the worst kind of like, we're going to have a fable. We're going to start with a fable that isn't obvious, that has that where a lesson, you're going to learn a lesson. Some trivial thing is going to happen, and great import is going to be grafted onto it so that we can tell you a morality play using this somewhat mundane experience. I've seen this in a million movies. It's almost always terrible. This is the worst one I've ever seen. The dialogue was terrible. The sentiment was awful. It was a bad idea, badly executed. And that was the first scene in the show. And but it's a good thing that they had Lenny Henry to save it. Because if that was it, I would have been, if I did grade that show based on that one scene, which by the way, they reference over and over again. And every time they do it, I'm like, so I thought that was fucking awful. However, when Galadriel figures out that that's Sauron and they have their something kind of miraculous happens. Right? Because this show has to do something no one's ever done before. Tolkien didn't have to do it. Peter Jackson didn't have to do it. Trying to think of, the BBC radio production didn't have to do it. They have to make Sauron a character with ideas and feelings and a motivation and a past and a future. And they have to basically invent that from whole cloth. And when that dude monologues at Galadriel, I thought, this is pretty convincing. It is very rare in modern media. I noticed this, I first noticed this with The Matrix. It is very rare in modern media where characters are allowed to have a point of view of any kind, because points of view alienate people. Whatever your point of view is, some people are going to agree with it and some people are going to disagree with it. And that means our shareholder value collapses, right? Which is why, it's one of the reasons, it's not the main reason, China. It's one of the main reasons all of these things, all these movies and media properties are all about family, because it's the least interesting thing we can talk about. It's not going to offend anybody. No one's going to get pissed off at it. I thought this with video games are the same way. They don't allow characters to have a point of view, right? I remember watching the original Battlestar Galactica, which was not a great show, but I was young and there was nothing else on. And probably the best part of that show was when they meet this, they discovered that there is a second Battlestar, Pegasus. And that means they're not alone. They're not the last humans. And not only are they not the last humans left alive, the other humans have a battleship. And not just a battleship, a legendary commander. A legendary military commander. The Galactica is commanded by a diplomat. But the Pegasus is commanded by a warrior. And they got really good casting for it too. They got a movie star to play him. And so the Galactica is like, oh, thank God, we'll make it to Earth now, and those guys aren't going to fuck with us anymore because we have you guys. Meanwhile, the Pegasus is saying, well, hang on a minute, we're not the only Battlestar. The Galactica is still around, and there's thousands of people. We can fight. We can fight. We don't have to run. We can stand and fight, right? And the thing about it is, they're both right. Those are two completely unreconcilable points of view. And they're both correct from that. We look at one side, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And then the other person starts talking, you're like, ooh, no, yeah, that makes sense. And then this person go, oh, no, yeah, right? And there's a word for that. It's called drama. And it is sorely lacking from modern things. Neo has no point of view, has no insight. He's played by Keanu Reeves, so there isn't really anything to say about him as a character. The reason he's the one is because the script picked him. And the reason there's no chemistry between him and Trinity, not only is there no chemistry between the actors, there's no reason to believe these people would ever like each other or fall in love, but the writers, they just have seen a lot of movies and they don't really understand them, right? So they're like, well, when there's a pretty boy and a pretty girl, they fall in love, don't they? And I'm like, but that's actually, there's usually a little more than that. So I hate that stuff. There's a lot of fake drama. Stranger Things has it. Anytime the bad guy needs to talk, It's like, it's just gibberish and it doesn't make any sense. It's just, I've seen movies and when in this moment, the bad guy goes blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, there's usually a little bit more to it than that, right? When Sauron did his little monologue, I believed it. I believed it. And I actually kinda believed that it would sway Galadriel. I don't mean convert her. I mean, make her think complexly about Sauron for a minute, right? That's a good bad guy monologue. Barry monologue. That's a good bad guy monologue where you believe that the good guy would stop for a second and go, wait, hang on a minute, right? Wait, is Killmonger right? Right? It's like, actually, yes, he is, but he's still a sociopathic asshole, and he's only using this language to get what he wants, right? He doesn't believe this stuff. He doesn't necessarily believe this stuff. It's just what he needs to say in order to get these people to rally around him, right? It's an argument of convenience. But so when they're like, Sauron, when he said, this was kind of breathtaking to me when he said, when Morgoth died, I don't know if he said died. I should watch it again. I might actually watch that episode again because it was good enough. It was good enough to watch again. I felt like I had a fist around my throat and it was finally let go. And I finally realized that if I was going to redeem myself, I had to heal Middle Earth. Here's the thing. Sauron would say that. He would believe it. He wouldn't just say it. He would believe it. But I didn't know that until I saw them do it. If you had asked me to write that scene, I would have been like, I don't know. I don't know what he would have said or what he would have thought or what he would have believed, and I'm not sure I would have come up with anything remotely good. But they did. They took that challenge of who is this guy and what does he want? He's got to have dialogue. He's going to be a character in the show. He's not just going to be a lidless floating eye. And I was like, fuck, that's cool. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of stuff with him and Galadriel that didn't make any sense and I never believed, right? So I'm not giving that entire sequence a glowing 5-star review. I'm saying that moment where his raison d'etre, his whole modus operandi, his reason for existing is, I was a servant of Morgoth, and now I realize that he was evil and I was wrong, and I'm gonna atone for my sins, and I'm gonna heal Middle Earth, by any means necessary, right? I was like, that's fucking cool. That's neat. Good for you. I think Galadriel would have been swayed by that for like a moment, but not in the show. She's a lot more kind of like, I don't know. She doesn't spend all her time trying to murder the dude, which is what the Galadriel we just spent 7 hours with would have done. Again, it's characters not behaving in a manner that is internally consistent, but in the manner that is necessary in order to move the plot forward. That is bad writing. And it's a hallmark of television writing because they got 10 days to get a script done. Yeah, no, Seraphim 333. That's the devil. It's exactly Tolkien. What would have been Tolkien's attitude toward a character like that? I told you I had done evil, and you didn't care. Galadriel was ready to forgive him. I don't know what that show's trying to say, by the way. Probably they don't either. But Galadriel wanted to forgive that guy because she needed his help and wanted to believe in him. So yeah, I thought that was actually really, really well done. And the fact that he kind of fucks around with her mind, that makes sense. Like, he's a demigod, right? He should be able to do stuff like that. And, but the fact that he made her go back and see her brother, I thought that was actually, I know why they did it. It does sort of make sense. But remember what I thought was the stupidest thing in the entire show? Why are you going to remind me of that? Don't go back there and remind me of that shit. It was dumb then and it's dumb now, right? So I didn't like that. And I also, this is the thing I really did not like and I really thought was actually kind of stupid. My opinion on this might soften in just a few hours, when I'm not streaming with an audience. But there is 0% chance that Galadriel discovers that Celebrimbor has been working with Sauron on the forging of some kind of fucking magic item, and she does not immediately run to the tower and just to completely throw all the tables over and destroy the whole thing and be like, I have no idea what's going on here. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, but that is Sauron, and I know it now, and I know I'm going to piss all you motherfuckers off, but that never stopped me before. I'm putting the kibosh on this whole thing. And not only does she not do that, she does the opposite. I refer you to my earlier statements about Bob Justman's memo and characters that do things that are wildly out of character and don't make any sense. Not just out of character, humans don't behave that way. People don't behave that way. Doesn't matter what their character is. No one would have done that, right? But that's a character behaving in a way that serves the plot because the ring's got to be made, right? It should have been when she woke up, it was already done, right? I would have bought that. But her being complicit in it and allowing it to happen after she knows who that guy is insane. Now, it would have made more sense to me, and I thought about this, it would have made more sense to me if that was Sauron posing as Galadriel. You know, Halbrand and Galadriel go away, and they have a big argument, and Galadriel comes back, and Halbrand's nowhere to be seen. I would have believed it if he had taken her form, right? But I don't think that's what happened, ? Maybe it did. I don't think so. So yeah, that was kind of fucking crazy to me. It kind of undid a lot of the work that they had done up until then. But remember what I said about Galadriel's motivation. It's not her character. I think her character is actually really, I think it's a really good actor doing an excellent job with a really good character. It's her motivation that I think is kind of like, that I don't believe in. I never believed in it. And now I really don't believe in it. So maybe it was, I mean, did we not see? Yeah, we did see Halbrand after that. I thought we did. So maybe that'll be revealed in season 2 where we find out that was Sauron. But we see him going into the upside down and looking at the, like, is that weird that the ending of season 4 of Stranger Things is the same as the end of Rings of Power? I thought that was weird. It works on a lot of people. A lot of people only need an excuse so they can hang their hat on it, right? You know, what did the DP tell Steven Spielberg when he's like, at this point, the mothership is going to rise up from behind Devil's Tower? And the DP is like, that doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? You've lost your mind? That thing's like, it's like, if Devil's Tower is this big, this spaceship is this big. Where was it? Is it buried under the earth? And Steven Spielberg said, if they're still with me at this point, that means I've got them by the balls and they'll go wherever I take them, right? That is that kind of like, all you have to do is give the audience something to hang their hat on. But if the payoff is stupid, you know, if you don't get this dope ass special effect, if it's a Fozzie Bear Muppet comes over Devil's Tower, we'd be like, well, that's stupid. You lost. It didn't matter what happened up until now. That was dumb, and you lost your audience. That's how I felt about that last sequence. So that was super, super weird. Why didn't she tell them? I mean, that makes sense to me. The idea that Galadriel would be ashamed, mortified, humiliated by the fact that Sauron tricked her, and she wouldn't be able to tell the other elf lords. That makes sense to me. But I think it would have been easier for her to just not be there. Just don't be there. You had a fight with Sauron and you went into each other's heads or whatever. And I really liked that actor's performance as Sauron. I thought he did a pretty good job. I was a little bit disappointed that he did not call himself Anatar, but I don't think they can do that because I don't think that is part of the license. I think that's Silmarillion-y. That's Silmarillion nonsense. But I did like it when he said, I was awake in the first silence before Eru Iluvatar started singing. I thought that was actually kind of cool poetic line and a good reveal, a good way of that character. Because there's got to be a moment, right, where he goes, yeah, I'm Batman. And that was a neat way for him to do it. I thought it was cool. There was one 2-shot they did where it's a close up of him and it's almost like a fisheye lens. And he kind of goes a little bit, Bilbo, let me see the ring, turn into Gollum moment. And then they cut to Galadriel and doing the same thing. And I thought that was cool. It was weird. They kind of took a little bit of a risk visually in this visual language they had. But I was like, that was weird, but it was a little bit cool. Right. So yeah, anyway. Yeah, it was. So yeah, there are things about the Rings of Power I like. There are things about it I didn't like. I think in the scope of TV shows, I think it's a good show. Is it a great show? Is it justified? No. Is it, is it the Sandbaggers? No. Is it I, Claudius? No. It's not going to be one of my all-time favorite shows or any of that nonsense. It's not the Venture Brothers. It's not Adventure Time. There are some brilliant fucking shows out there. And the Rings of Power, I don't think is one of them, but it's fun. It's good enough. It's good enough for me. Right. Is it possible that they could lose me? Sure. If I get 2 episodes in a row and nothing happens, that's usually enough for me to be like, you don't need me. This show doesn't need an audience. But I only had one of those really. Episode 7, the previous episode to the finale, I felt like they just could have cut it and no one would have noticed. Yeah. Yeah, considered a gift was awesome. C flat, B sharp. I thought that was a really, momentous, portentous line. What did I think of Adar and the orcs overall? Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that whole thing was pretty cool. I liked it. I thought that whole scene went on way too long and not a whole lot happened with all the Dutch angles between Galadriel and Adar. I think they're saying that that's an Uruk. Okay, that's fine. A corrupted elf. That makes sense. That's where the orcs started. They started off as corrupted elves. So that's cool. But that shot was it was not very tastefully done. And but I thought it was neat. I liked the elves end up on a chain gang. That was kind of cool. That was unexpected, and they have to fight their way out. That's kind of cool. The orcs, to me, they're sort of taking Peter Jackson's visual language for the orcs, and they're pushing it, and I like that, so that the orcs all look like mutants from like Gamma World or something like that. I think that's cool, right? No one would look at those orcs and say that they're analogs for any real world people, and that's the challenge, and I think they did a good job with it. So I liked it. I thought it was cool. I like our orcs better, but I've seen our orcs, and most of you folks haven't. So yeah, Arondir is probably one of my favorite characters. And I like getting to see actors being given the chance to play a Vulcan, because actors love science fiction because they get to play characters that they would never get to play otherwise. Like, look at Jerry Ryan. I have met Jerry Ryan in real life. I was the person who had to pick her up from the airport and drive her to the show when she was one of our guests at Gen Con. And she is probably 5 times prettier in real life than she was on TV. And I was completely like, I was just the driver. I had no capacity to make small talk or anything. I was just completely gobsmacked, right? And that's the kind of actor that would be very easily typecast and never get to do anything meaty, right? But she got to play a fucking Borg, and she really did it and played it to the hilt. Look at Tim Russ. I don't know why I'm talking about Voyager actors. That's one of the yeah, it's a terrible fucking show. But they getting to play these aliens and these alien points of view. Actors love that, because when do they get to do that normally? Normally, actors are just playing people in the real world that do real things. I got to play a judge. I got to play a mom. I got to play a cop. And it all kind of becomes interchangeable. But I got to play an alien. That sounds cool, right? And so getting to watch that actor play an alien, get them to play a Vulcan, I was like, fuck, I like this guy a lot. Right. And when the other elf is like, you know what I think? I think you're falling for a blah, blah, blah. And he goes, I think you talk too much or something like that. I thought that was a lot of that stuff is really cool. Well, the walking song from The Hobbit's very Tolkien. I don't know. It was kind of weird. It was one of those things where the characters behave really inconsistently. They behave in the way that is necessary for the plot to advance, where their walking song was about no one gets left behind. And then they stop and give a list of all the people that got left behind for, in many cases, what seemed like very trivial reasons. Right. And even when the reason is not that trivial, like, oh, that guy broke his leg and now they have to worry about being left behind. I'm like, you broke a leg? Does that not, you people don't have hospitals and, aspirin and shit like that. Stuff like this has to happen all the time. Right. So you're telling me every time that happens, people get left behind? You can't just put them in a wagon. Why do you have wagons if they can't carry sick people? Right. That was super weird and didn't make any sense to me. So that's my take on, The Rings of Power. I like it. It is not without flaws. Some of those flaws are kind of more egregious than others, but it is not without virtues. And some of those virtues I find really surprising and I like. And I actually liked Fiona Apple singing the Ring poem. I was like, this is cool. There were 1 or 2 harmonic decisions that I disagreed with, but anyway.